Hi everyone, how you doing? Welcome to another episode of Total Immunology. My name's Ross, and I'm a consultant scientist working in the NHS for an immunology lab. And today I want us to go through talking about the very first line of defense for the immune system. So way before we get excited about different cells or different proteins that are produced specifically from those cells, we actually have a whole array of different obstacles for pathogens to try and overcome before they can even get into the body. So one of the things that we have to think about here, and I've led from previous videos, is the idea about why are these pathogens trying to get in? They want to live on you or inside you purely because they want the energy that you have as your body or the food that you're consuming that they want to get hold of, because they want to pass on their DNA to their generation. They want to replicate, they want to produce more of themselves. That's all it is. And so they will try to be able to get inside you because there's more of that delicious energy inside you, particularly in your bloodstream. And that's where they're always trying to head. But they have to start on the many layers of you to get in. So I'm going to go through a talk here where we're going to talk about the various parts of your structure, which are the very first lines of stopping those pathogens from being able to invade into you. Okay, so we're going to jump into the video now and we'll move on from there. I like to think of us in this analogy, and there are many analogies for the immune system, but I'd like to think of this analogy being particularly around the idea of us being a castle. It's very good as an analogy here because it's got a nice defensive nature to it, which is what you have to think of yourself as. And, it doesn't take a lot for us to move from that image of the castle to then thinking of us as a person. It doesn't have to even be a human. You can think of yourself as a different animal, but we're all very much protecting ourselves from the outside world in this regard. And when we think about this particular structure, one of the first things we have to think about is what the material is that we have on the outside of us. What are we made of that keeps the outside outside and the inside inside? And so for us, that is our skin. In this analogy, it's those brick walls. And just the same as the brick wall, which is made up of lots of little components, your skin is made of lots of little components in the sense of skin cells, and it has multiple layers to it as well. And one of the things about your skin as a property is, first of all, it's water resistant. It is a complete layer that goes around your body as an unbroken membrane. It is water resistant. It doesn't soak up any water. It doesn't let any water get in, which would be dangerous because that means pathogens could use it to get inside. It has actually the complete opposite. It's actually waxy. It's dead on the outside. The very outer layer is already a set of dead cells, and the live cells are growing underneath and moving upwards. And so it is not a particularly fun place for things to live. It's quite barren to live on. What's more, you actually produce substances with your skin that then go on to the outside. One of those is a type of oil, and we call that sebum. And the other one is sweat. Well, sweat is a response to being hot. We're going to put water on the outside of our skin, and that water is going to evaporate off, and it's going to consume energy from our skin in order to be able to evaporate, and thus taking away heat energy from our body. Both of these compounds, the oil and the sweat, both contain additional chemicals and proteins inside them that are antimicrobial in nature, i.e., they disrupt the metabolism of those organisms. They make it harder for those organisms to live there and to be able to replicate on that existence. Okay, so number one obstacle is just the skin, the outer layer of us, full stop. One of the things we have to think about is if we had a perfect organism that was never going to get invaded by anything, one of the things about that is you would limit how many holes you have, because holes are bad. Holes are effectively direct entry into your body, and you don't want that. So what you need to think about is, why do we have the holes? We have the holes because you need to be able to take things in that you definitely want. What things do you want? You want air, you want water, and you want food. You need the food for the energy. You yourself want to replicate and pass your DNA on, and that does require energy. So you have to consume that. You need the water to keep alive as well, to hydrate, and you need air to be able to breathe. And all of those things make a heady mix for something called respiration. All of those properties need holes to be able to do things. You also need some holes to help you be able to see and detect the world around you as well. And so we already have loads of those holes just on the front of our face. And our face is actually one of the most delicate places, because inside our face is our skull, and inside our skull is our brain. and our brain is the epicenter of all thinking and behavior that we're going to have. So it's very important to protect it. The other thing that we have in those photos that I haven't got very good in this initial one is ears, and we mustn't forget those either. They're two additional holes that, like eyes, are designed not for us to be able to take in nutrients, but they're there to take in information, equally important for us to be able to survive against the outside world. When we come onto eyes, they are incredibly sophisticated. And actually, most of the time, they're what we call immunoprivileged. Immunoprivileged means that we don't put the immune system around the eye too much for fear that if the immune system got overexcited, it could actually do damage to the eye. And one of the things that animals have evolved as an understanding is that if the immune system hurts the eye or damages the eye, it could be permanent, and having bad eyes or having eyes that are damaged decreases your chance of living and therefore decreases your chances of passing on your DNA. So the evolution has happened that the immune system doesn't really go near the eye, it's too risky. So instead, the eye has to employ its own thing, own factors and strategies. And so one of the things it has is tears. As though we use them behaviorally as a measurement of extreme emotion, they are primarily designed to keep the eye clean. It's a water, but it's not just water. It actually contains loads of different subchemicals, compounds in there. Most of them are lipid based, actually, and fat. And again, they're there to flush and clean the eye out. They're there to keep it moist and safe so it doesn't dry out. And also, they have antimicrobial compounds again there to try and stop anything being able to live on the surface of the eye. If we look at the ear, you would want the same sort of thing. Not being able to hear things is more likely to make it harder for you to be able to find your food that you need and to protect yourself from being hurt from others. But you can't use a liquid clearance system like tears in this case, because can you imagine your ears every time they get a little bit weird filling up with fluid? It would really damage the way they work. So we can't use a liquid clearance system. So instead, we have a solid clearance system. And that again uses a fat based molecule, it uses wax. And that waxy substance is secreted by the cells and used to trap and gum up anything that might be living inside there so that it can be trussed up and can't act on what it wants to do and to move it out of the ear again. And it would often come eventually to work its way from the inside to the outside of the ear. The final one we have on there is the nose. The nose has two jobs. One, it's a sensory input, so it gives us information. But secondly, it also allows us to get oxygen into our body. So two functions that it needs. And the nose is one of the entrances that we have to the respiratory tract. We have two. One is the mouth, one is the nose. And their job is to be able to get oxygen in, but also to take information. And these are great examples of what we call mucosal linings. So a mucosal lining is very common throughout the body. And actually, we have mucosal linings that run from the very top of our body all the way through to the bottom of our body. And again, it is effectively a type of skin layer, I guess, but it's like a wet interface, it's moist, it's what we call semi-permeable, which means that lots of molecules can travel through it. So it's not resistant and solid like skin, it's much more open to absorption. But the risk is with that absorption is that you now end up with something that is far more likely to be invaded. So there is this balancing act here of we want something that is able to allow us to take on substances, but we also need to protect it from being abused from the outside world, from pathogens. How do we do that? We have two things. We have in lots of areas of mucosal linings, we have something called cilia. These are tiny, tiny microscopic hairs that grow on the outside of cells themselves. So the tiny subunits that make up the lining have cells as hairs that are produced. And those hairs are much like, if you imagine in this image over here, seagrass or seaweed that floats on the bottom of the seabed and moves with the tides. You can see the ebb and the flow of those pieces, those blades are much like cilia, and they beat. And the point of that beating is to be able to waft and move anything that's sitting on top of those in one particular direction. So it may be hard to understand, but I just want you to realize how sophisticated that each of these cells that live alongside each other adjacently are able to coordinate the beating of themselves. So this isn't lots of blades of grass effectively or blades of hair that are just beating indiscriminately and unsynchronized. There is synchronized movement to move things in a coordinated direction. How do we make sure that the things are moved and they're not just able to avoid or override those hairs? We use effectively a slime. and we produce this slime. That slime is called mucus. And mucus is produced by a mucosal lining. You can see the link there from the name. And it's produced in response. There is a low level amount of production all of the time, but it upregulates if it knows that there is a problem. So we see this all the time. When you have a cold, you get a snotty nose. Okay. And a mucus, just so we can start thinking about substances, mucus is far more sugary in its origin. Okay. It's a protein with sugar wrapped around it, and that's why, if you remember as a child, you used to taste snot, it always tasted a bit sweet. It's because of the sugar in it. So this is a very important aspect of mucosal linings, and we're going to see that again later on in the talk. The other hole that we have on the front of our face that we use again for bringing in oxygen, but also for allowing food to come in and water to come into our system to give us energy and substance, is going to be our mouth. Now, our mouth initially has things like teeth that can break down giant, great big things. That's fine. But often our microbes are tiny, tiny things, and they often live on our teeth, if anything. So that can be a problem. So, what do we have in our mouth to help? We have saliva. Saliva, again, is another fluid that we secrete in our mouths on purpose to be able to help primarily break down food. Okay, so it has enzymes in it, which are complex proteins that are designed to do one simple job on a particular chemical compound in your area that it works in. But also, the enzymes in there are able to attack the structures of the pathogens as well. So they're able to try and break down and deconstruct any of those three-dimensional proteins that are the microbes. But some of these things are going to go through your mouth. They're going to get chewed or masticated, as we call it. And they're now going to go down your esophagus, which is a mucosal lining, and they're going to go into your stomach. And your stomach is the beginning of what we call digestion, where we're now going to, once we've broken down these things, we're going to start to now assimilate. We're going to take them on into our bloodstream and distribute that extra resource around our body. So, how are we going to ensure that if a pathogen's managed to get in now, it's now got into the very center of our body, and that's quite dangerous. So, how are we going to control for this? Well, your stomach has a decontamination zone. And that decontamination zone is simply, it is filled with a very, very strong acid. And stomach acid is there to just simply sterilize and disinfect everything that's put inside it. Now, this is something that we don't often think about, because if you learn about biology on the context of digestion, what you often learn is that when you put different foods inside your stomach, for instance, proteins, that you have special enzymes inside your stomach that will work on the protein and break that protein down. And that protein, those enzymes are designed to work in very, very acidic conditions. And it can sometimes get confused that you think, the stomach has stomach acid to be able to make the environment very pleasant and preferred for the enzymes to do their job to dissolve your proteins. That is not the case. What has happened is that the enzymes have adapted to work in an acidic condition. Okay. And the reason for that is because, very simply, protecting your body from infection is far more important than maximizing your digestion. It's pointless being able to break down all the protein that you eat if you're then going to die of food poisoning. That would defeat the purpose. So ultimately, the acid in your stomach is there to disinfect everything that you put inside your body, rather than to make it so that the enzymes work better. So you've now got everything in the center of your body, and much like our castle again, don't forget it's still there, is that we have to produce waste. And we have to produce waste either as solid waste, or we have to produce waste as water waste. And so that often comes out of the bottom of our body, and that's where our koala bear is showing here. And we have two sets of waste, as I said, solid and liquid. And we either have that coming out of the anus, or we have that coming out of the urethra. Okay, and when we have those two areas, again, they're both mucosal linings. And what's important about them is that they have very important localized immune systems there to protect. They have cells on standby as well. They can also produce mucus if needed to, and that mucus can also contain lots of important protein when threatened. So just because they are holes that are involved with things being leaving the body rather than coming into the body, please don't think that that means that the pathogens will follow the same rules. It's an exit only hole for you, but it's not an exit only hole for the pathogen. Now, all the holes I've controlled and talked about and the structure I've talked about have been gender neutral, but actually we have to concentrate on the female gender here more importantly than the male, because the female system has some very important holes that are important for the survival of your entire race. If they don't have them and they don't work, and the most important one of those is the vagina. If you don't have a vagina, we can't give birth to more people, and you, even if you're a male, can't pass on your DNA. So we have to make sure that vaginas are structurally built to be able to stop out pathogens from infecting them. And actually, out of all the systems I've talked about here, the vagina is one of the most highly sophisticated ones. It's a mucosal lined system again, just the same as we've talked about the mouth, and we've talked about the esophagus, and we've talked about the gut and the anus and the urethra, and the respiratory lining. But it has three other areas to it. First of all, it's very acidic, and that acid is making it very unpleasant for microbes to be able to live there so that they can replicate. Secondly, it has its own local immune system secretions that it uses, and it has its own circulating cells as well in that area of the body. And finally, again, it uses those cilia. So you have those beating cilia even in the vaginal tract as much as you have in the respiratory tract. So these three factors are incredibly important. And again, always, if you're ever trying to work out how evolution has worked and tries to, evolution has prioritized which things are the most important around this idea of passing on DNA. And that's why the vagina is so much better at being able to control itself as a separate system. We even have some transient holes. These holes are not things that are always available for invasion, but become more susceptible at certain times in the life of an animal, particularly a mammal in this case. And that is to do with the breasts, particularly again, in the context of a female who has just given birth, you will have a lactating breast. And that breast is incredibly important because, again, from an immunology point of view, this allows you to nourish the child, give it energy, keep it alive. So you're increasing the chances that one day it will pass on your DNA to another generation. But secondly, you're able to do what we call passive transfer of the immune system. I'm not going to cover that in this episode, and we'll cover it in later episodes. But the problem with that is that you are creating, again, although it's an exit only hole, you will leave it very susceptible to pathogens being able to get in and infect it. And so one of these clinical conditions you can have is called mastitis. And mastitis is very painful and involves bacteria being able to enter into the lactating mammary gland, and be able to cause infection inside there. And so we said already that the breast is involved, breast milk contains immune proteins like IgA inside it. But that IgA, as well as being important to pass on to the child, is very important at being able to protect the mucosal lining of the mammary gland. So these holes are all really important to our survival as a species and really important to our function on a day-to-day basis, but they do leave us susceptible, and we have to be very careful with them. And so we have to remember that the world outside is quite inhospitable, and there's lots of things out there that could do us harm. So our basic structure has got to be as refined as possible to protect us. So all of those things I've talked about are planned holes. Unfortunately, actually, where most of the problems come with infection is when we have an unplanned hole in our body. And that's where we break, normally, where we break the skin. And as soon as we break the skin barrier, that suddenly overcomes those main obstacles that we have. And we then have to rely on additional processes to be able to protect us. And that's where we start to enter the idea of the immune system. So, very, very important that we will start to look at that in the upcoming episodes. I hope this has been useful for you. Again, to keep these as short as possible. Please subscribe and like for this video, and please put any questions that you have in the comment section, and I'll be happy to try and do it. And hopefully see you again for another episode soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.